Finance Minister Arun Jaitley today said the government will table the Goods and Services Tax Bill in the winter session of Parliament, raising hopes that the much-awaited tax reform will kick in by next year itself. The breakthrough came after the centre gave in to the demand from states on their compensation package, although discussions are still on over the threshold turnover for the purpose of GST.
Sources tell your channel that the Finance Ministry has already floated a cabinet note after sorting out the tricky issue of tax treatment on petroleum products. The government had earlier set a deadline of April 2016 for GST rollout, but it looks like the uniform tax will kick in much before that.
Dr. Arvind Virmani, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Dr. Virmani, thank you so much for joining us live on ET Now. Do you get a sense, you someone who's also in many ways worked with this reform over the years, during a stint at North Block as well, do you get a sense that we're now probably a step closer and significantly closer rather to the rollout of GST, because this has been a reform that we've talked about now for well over, 6 years now?
Yeah, it's been a long time. There are two types of issues. To me, the compensation issue is more a political issue. But the last one you mentioned, the OCTRA, is really a more serious economic issue. But let's start from some of the points you mentioned on petroleum products and alcohol. Actually, the version of this, what I used to call a national VAT, which I recommended almost a decade ago, actually said to have the overall tax uniform or as close to uniform as possible, but include everything, but then give a little flexibility to the states on top of this to have, let's say, 6 commodities, maybe 2 petroleum products, couple of alcohol products, to allow them to impose what we call a final goods sales tax. Effectively, that's a very efficient tax, and it also gives them the flexibility. But never mind, we have adopted a certain framework of GST, and the issue was really to reach a compromise which is acceptable to the state. So from what you just said on your program, the compromise is that instead of having a uniform rate which includes petroleum products and alcohol, they will keep it 0 for the first 3 years. I think as a compromise, as long as the issue of having that uniform rate on these 2 commodities or these 2 sets of commodities is open, I think that is a fair compromise for the time being.
Right. Dr. Virmani, if I may actually take a cue from what you said, a compromise nonetheless. Does the compromise in some sense mean that this is going to be a half-baked attempt, something that is being done just in name because a deadline has to be met, especially given all the exclusions? Yes, you may say this is only for 3 long years, but we're starting with exclusions to begin with.
No, I don't think so, because as I said, those 2 commodities was something which I knew. I mean, as I said, even my version, which is only marginally different from what my good friend Vijay Kelkar recommended in the GST. The question is not, the problem comes if you constitutionally lock yourself into an inefficient system. As long as you don't constitutionally lock on it, I have no problem. You can reach, if it gives you the flexibility to reach a much better system, over 5 years or 6 years, that's not a problem. The problem arises, for example, has arisen when your insurance bill had a 26% rate in the bill itself. If you had kept it as a decision outside the law, these are things which evolve and change. So it's not a problem. No, I would not call it a problem as long as that flexibility is in the law.
You mentioned rates, and I'm going to take the liberty of asking this question on rates particularly, given that consensus is still elusive. The fact that rates could be in the range of 26% as against the earlier 16 to 18% range previously being discussed, does that make GST a non-starter? Isn't that way too high for anybody's comfort?
Right, so that's a good question, because a lot of people are probably are not very clear what that means. Actually, the simulations that I'm familiar with, which I think are the basis of the discussions, have a range of rates going from 18 to 28. Why? Well, it depends on the exemption. For example, if you have no exemptions, and the kind of exemption I'm thinking of is not what we just discussed, but things like food, medicines, education. These are the 3 critical areas where some kind of a consensus has to be, and I'm sure they built it, but they haven't told us. I mean, I don't know what the final position is, but if you don't exempt any of these, you can have a much lower rate. You will be more on the 18% side. But say you exempt the whole of the food, you will have a slightly higher rate. If you also exempt medical medicines and medical services, you will have a slightly higher rate. And if you exempt education, you will have still higher. So unless one sees what are the things being exempted, it's hard for me to say. But it's really linked to that. It's linked to issues which, you know, most of us agree maybe do need to be exempted. You know, those three, the critical ones. So unless we know what decision has been taken, it's a little difficult to comment more specifically.
Dr. Virmani, you did speak at length about some of these exemptions or exclusions as they are called, and you know there is a political imperative there which is understandable, especially in the case of say liquor or even real estate to some extent. But you know, what about the economic rationale? Don't you think that you know giving so many exemptions or having so many you know things out of the net, in a sense, could create serious amount of distortions in the supply chain?
Yes, that actually I am more concerned, you know, with, you know, if you have a simple uniform tax, what it means is administratively it becomes very, very easy to enforce and monitor. That's really the point which, you know, having worked and seen how the tax administration operates and been involved in reform, that's the part which worries me. But, you know, where we are talking about exemption, there's a difference between things which are exempted as within the supply chain versus what we call a final goods. Actually, the inefficiency doesn't arise from the final goods taxes. For example, petrol sold to the consumer, that's kind of a final good. It's not part of the supply chain. Of course, in the case of petrol and diesel, some of it also goes into the supply chain, which is why the general recommendation, which I agree with, is that it should be at the base rate at least, it should be part of that VAT system. But having one or two items like that which are close to, which actually are kind of part final goods and part not, I don't think destroys the whole system. It's really, to me, the much more important issue is octroi, because one of the things you really want, which can give a big kick to efficiency of the Indian economy and manufacturing, is that if you can get rid of octroi. Right. Because there is huge wastage of time and fuel in that.
Right. Quick final word, Dr. Virmani.
So in some sense, that is more important than this. Yeah.
Sure. Quick final word. What's your sense? Do you think, do you think GST will meet its April 2016 deadline? We've seen many deadlines missed on GST. Do you think that deadline will be met? And also, finally, what's the big picture? The fact that, you know, this is a reform, it's taken us 7-8 years to bring some sort of political consensus. And despite the political capital that this government enjoys, which markets and all seem to be rejoicing, the fact remains that it is going to be tough to push through reforms that involves bringing consensus with states, whether it's land bill, whether it's labor reforms, or whether it's GST. Would you agree with that assessment?
So as far as this bill is concerned, remember that once the parliament passes it, it has to be approved by a certain proportion of states. Constitutionally, I forget whether it's 2/3 or whatever it is. So that is the point which will take about a year, and that is why, you know, even if parliament passes it within this year, one would expect that the whole process will occur over the next year. As far as any general implications, I think it's always good, you know, reforms, from my experience, even though we talk a lot about big bang reform, that is to me more of a political argument. You know, what I have seen across countries is as long as the direction is good, as long as reforms keep happening, the influence on the economy is positive. You don't need like a big bang reform to get the economy moving. The argument for big bang is really a political one of having an opportunity, and perhaps we'll discuss it at some other time. So I think it's good, even if it occurs after 5 years or 6 years, it gives a very strong signal that we are now on the path which in a way is reflected in what's happening in the stock market. So it gives confirmation to all those who have put in more money, and hopefully also brings the day nearer when the gap between the financial flows and the real investment kind of catches up. Real investment is growing, but obviously not as fast as the stock market, and I do think the passing of this bill will give a boost to that.
Dr. Arvind Virmani, always a pleasure chatting with you, especially when it comes to big ticket policy reforms. And like you say, big bang is a fashionable word. It needs more such action to keep the economy moving.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.